Hi, welcome back to the Progressive Primitivist, where we believe the only way to go forward in religion is to go back to the Bible. There may not be a more villainized individual amongst churches of Christ as Rubel Shelly. And recently, Caleb Robertson did a sit-down interview with Dr. Shelly, where Dr. Shelly talks about his life and his rise and his fall amongst conservative a cappella churches of Christ. During the course of the interview, Caleb brings up a book that Dr. Shelly wrote called Sing His Praises, a Case for A Cappella Music as Worship Today. In a way, this was a love letter back to conservative churches of Christ to let them know that he was changing, but he wasn't changing entirely. And in 1988, he presented 3 lessons on this topic from his book at the ACU Lectures. And so you are listening to one of those 3 lectures today. We think that you're going to enjoy these lectures.
Good morning to you, and welcome to this second session. I see more of you are up now than were going at the early session this morning at 8:30. I hope you enjoyed your sleep, and the only thing that I begrudge is that I had to get up earlier. A number of you were here for the early morning session, and for those who weren't, let me just tell you something of the plan for these 3 lessons. First, my plan is that I have to get from here back very quickly to my hotel to check out and get back to make another speech at 1:30 before I make another one at 3:30 and go catch the plane at 5:30 or 6. So somebody who can help me get away and who has a vehicle, I don't have one, I need to see you and supplicate right at the end of the lecture. I need a ride over to the Holiday Inn to be able to load up and get out of my room before I come back. Might be worth a lunch to you if you can do that. Getting back to the issue at hand, this morning I outlined sort of a 3-part division of some material that I wanted to share with you. And since 2 of my bosses from 20th Century Christian are here this hour, I'd better remind you again that the fuller version of it is in a little book that's been off the press a few months called Sing His Praise, that 20th Century Christian has put in print. That book was written at the request of people in the Churches of Christ instrumental or independent Christian churches. After some contact I'd had with a number of them at various restoration forums, etc., they said, we only know your view through caricature. And talking with some of you, we find out that we really don't know your view as you present your view. Would you put that material in some form where we could deal with it? And that's the reason for this little book called Sing His Praise. And I think it's over in the tent at several different locations. But you might be interested in looking at that, maybe a copy for the church library or your own personal library. The material in the book is basically divided into 3 units. I look first at the theological question, which is basically an issue of hermeneutics, biblical interpretation. How do you understand authority? Where the basic thesis, the one that I presented this morning, is that it's sort of wrong-headed to say, show me where the New Testament prohibits instrumental music. That if you understand authority in what I believe is a biblical way, the proper question is, where does the New Testament authorize X? Well, I can find authority for singing, and in the absence of my ability to find any for instrumental music, I choose to believe, I am forced to believe by that interpretive principle, that the praise of God vocally, with the voice, is authorized of God, right and proper, and to be encouraged, and that the praise of God with instrumental music is something that has no biblical warrant and therefore is something that I cannot encourage and in fact feel compelled to oppose. I tried to explain that authority principle, to defend it, both at a common sense level and at a biblical level, to show that the silence of Scripture can be, when shown in context to have some presumed exclusionary intent, eliminate, even without specifying, certain additional options. And I believe there is warrant for believing that in these statements made about the musical praise that the church offers to God, that the precedent is for seeing exclusionary intent because of the sorts of music known both in Jewish and Greek circles, and that the exclusionary intent was clearly there, and that you buttress that with something of the history of the synagogue and the early church, and it becomes a very powerful case for understanding New Testament authority that way, that there is in fact an exclusionary intent with regard to music other than that's offered by the voice. Then in this afternoon session, the one at 3 or 3:30, whenever that one is, 3:30 I think, we're going to look in more detail at church history, both biblical church history and early centuries church history, and then move forward very quickly to recent church history, post-Protestant Reformation church history, both in Europe and in the United States, to show that we were not the only ones who were still without the use of instrumental music. The early days in the colonies, for example, no churches used instrumental music, and that when they began to be introduced, it was with great protest and fervor among Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists and other groups, and that our position was by no means unique back in those early days. It was the common position. But at this hour, what I want to do is to focus on the musical vocabulary of the New Testament, to look in particular at a word around which there has been a great deal of controversy as to whether or not it includes or somehow excludes instrumental music, and that's the word psallo, the verb, or the noun form psalmos, psalm. I do think that one of the more important investigations relating to this whole question of instrumental music as praise to God has to do with this issue of musical vocabulary. More specifically, psallo, the verb translated in the King James Version, making melody, also the American Standard Version, making melody, the Revised Standard Version, sing psalms, or the New International Version, make music or sing. And then the noun psalmos, a noun that's usually not even translated so much as transliterated, psalm in our English version. The point at issue is, does this word signify singing with the human voice, or does it somehow either require or allow accompaniment by some form of mechanical instrument? Well, to set it historically, back in 1920, O.E. Payne published a book which argued that psallo means to play on the harp, and that in the New Testament, when that word appears, you therefore have explicit authorization in the New Testament for playing musical instruments in worship. It is, of course, that word, psallo, that occurs in passages like Ephesians 5:19. It occurs in James 5:13. Any among you marry, let him psallo. Romans 15:9. 1 Corinthians 14:15. In fact, it occurs 2 times in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 15, where Paul talks about singing with the Spirit, singing with the understanding. Well, in Payne's book, he argued that that word means play the harp. The same argument has been made more recently by men that I've gotten to know in the Independent Christian Church, Tom Burgess and Dwayne Dunning. In fact, I had a public debate with Dwayne Dunning on this issue a few years ago in Mason City, Iowa. As to the lexical data pertinent to these words, Tom Burgess, in a book that has been circulated very widely among independent Christian churches, says, quote, "The force of the lexicons stands unitedly for songs sung to instrumental accompaniment." It's a strong claim. Of the noun, psalmos, Brother Dunning says, quote, and notice I do call them brothers, reference back to this morning. I don't believe the instrumental music issue determines whether a person can obey the gospel and be included in the fellowship of believers known as the church. It's an issue of faithfulness among brethren. Brother Dunning writes of the noun, psalmos, psalm is an instrumental performance, which may be but does not absolutely require that it be accompanied by the voice. You have to listen to that one to appreciate really how strong it is. That it's principally instrumental, And it may allow, but doesn't even require, the voice to be included. And of the verb, solo, he says, quote, massive evidence shows that an instrument inheres in solo exactly and essentially as much water inheres in baptizo. Well, in this hour, I want to investigate some of the musical vocabulary of the Greek New Testament with a view toward evaluating claims like that. And I will be able to demonstrate, and will be able to demonstrate from sources that are not biased to my case in the least, and will go to great pains to use only such sources that can be considered objective or even theologically against my point of view. I'll be able to show you that the word solo authorizes vocal praise to God through song, and that it has no reference in its Jewish Christian usage to mechanical instruments of music in New Testament literature. I want to clarify on the front end, however, that I am not making the argument that solo or any other of the Greek words involved means do not play pianos or inveighs against instrumentation in general. And I go back to the point made this morning that if Scripture somewhere authorizes instruments as appropriate for use by Christians, the word solo or ado or humneo or any of the other words, they would not preclude their use. But it's going back to this interpretive principle. That what's at stake is not that I'm obliged to find in the New Testament either a statement or a term that prohibits instruments. What I feel obliged to find is something that authorizes. Well, I can find words that authorize singing. And since that's all I can find, that's all the authority I believe I have. And I do not believe I can go beyond that. So all I'm claiming about solo is not that the word inveighs against instruments. That would be a mistaken claim. I'm simply claiming that the word solo authorizes singing, and that that's all that it authorizes, that in none of its New Testament usages does it indicate or allow instrumentation, and therefore, if we're going to do only what's authorized by the New Testament, we're authorized to sing, and that's it. Well, I think you begin your study maybe just by looking at lexical data on the verb solo. The Grimm-Wilke lexicon that we know in English through Thayer and his translation says that the verb means to pluck off, to pull out, to cause to vibrate by touching, to twang, to touch or strike the chord, to twang the strings of a musical instrument so that they gently vibrate, and absolutely to play on a stringed instrument, to play the harp, etc. In the Septuagint for nagan, and much oftener for zamar, to sing to the music of the harp, and in the New Testament to sing a hymn, to celebrate the praise of God in song. Now, the definition that is given in that Thayer translation is one that reflects the interesting fact that the word solo has undergone significant change, significant etymological change in the history of its use. The word solo, as Thayer indicates, originally just means to pluck when it first begins to occur in Greek literature. It's used of twitching a carpenter's line to leave his chalk line. Later, an archer pulling the string back, twanging his bow. And that is its use in its early days, but the word undergoes change. The first change it begins to undergo is it begins to talk about the sort of twanging that's done in the making of music, playing harps. And in classical Greek, the word continued to be used that way even into the New Testament period. But in the Septuagint, the word began to be used of singing to musical accompaniment. And in the Septuagint, produced in the 3rd century BC, the Septuagint, if you don't know the term, is the Greek translation of Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament. The Greek translation of Hebrew Scripture produced in the 3rd century before Christ. Not an inspired translation. The Old Testament wasn't written in Greek, but it does reflect the contemporary usage in the Greek language of that time, and it's used to translate, alternately, to translate some words that mean to play or to sing. David, for example, solos on his harp. He plays on his harp, or perhaps sings to his harp. But as the word continues to undergo change, Thayer points out that by the time we come to Jewish Christian usage in the New Testament, the word means, and I quote him again, to sing a hymn, to celebrate the praise of God in song. Words do undergo change in all languages. And part of the confusion about psallo, as I'll point out later, is that people who use instrumental music in worship can point to lexicons and dictionaries and correspondence with Greek professors at major universities saying that the meaning of psallo is to play a harp. Without exception, they will be citing classical lexicons and dictionaries, and they will be writing to the classics departments of universities. Because in classical Greek, the High Greek of, say, Aristotle and Plato, which is much harder Greek than New Testament Greek, much more complex syntax, etc. The word continued to have that meaning right on through the New Testament era. But Jewish Christian usage is what is reflected in New Testament scholarship and in New Testament lexicons. And in all New Testament lexicons and dictionaries, you find the same sort of tracing of the history of the word that you find in the German lexicon that Thayer translates and that most of us just call the Thayer lexicon. And that is that in Jewish Christian usage, the word comes to refer to vocal praise. Well, I'll get back to that point, but I'm just showing you how it happens in Thayer. We'll come back to it. Robinson, or rather Moulton and Milligan, in their vocabulary of the Greek New Testament, quote, properly to play on a harp, that is, its classical usage, but in the New Testament, as in James 5:13, to sing a hymn. The German lexicographer, Walter Bauer, to extol by singing praises, to sing praises. And then as that Bauer lexicon, the 5th edition, is translated into English by Arndt and Gingrich, and most of you know that lexicon not with the Bauer, but just as Arndt and Gingrich. Quote, sing to the accompaniment of a harp. Sing praise. In the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the TD&T, Kittle's Theological Dictionary, quote, the word auto, to sing of, there is no distinction from psallo in Ephesians 5:19. Or, in the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, quote, in the New Testament, 2 basic meanings can be ascertained. Psalmos, the noun, stands for the Psalms of the Old Testament, or the so-called Ketubim, the writings. And B, more generally, psalmos means a hymn of praise, and psallo, the verb, to sing a spiritual or sacred song. Now, you'll notice that in that list, standard lexicons, only one of them, and yet it is a notable exception, only one of them indicates that the New Testament usage of psallo or psalmos indicates a song done to the accompaniment of a harp. It is a notable exception because it's the Arndt and Gingrich lexicon. We'll have to look at it because most of us who work with New Testament Greek are accustomed to referring to the Arndt and Gingrich lexicon as the crown jewel of New Testament lexicons. So it's a major matter to have to look at one within the series of 6 or 7 that I read that says something that's different from the others. All of the others tracing the etymology, classically this, in the Septuagint this, in the New Testament to sing. Why is Arndt and Gingrich reporting something different? The correct meaning of any Greek word has to be determined from usage and context, and that's true of any word in any language, and no lexicon, or in English, no dictionary, is infallible in its examination of such usage. And that's to say that merely pointing to a lexicon that contains a definition in agreement with my position is not enough to settle it conclusively, and therefore for me to say, well, Thayer says this, and Bauer says this, and Moulton Milligan say that doesn't nail it down. Nor does quoting Arndt and Gingrich necessarily blow the case, because lexicons and dictionaries are just that. They are attempts to offer a definition based on usage and context, but if we're going to be serious, we're going to have to go and look in some of those very places ourselves. All lexicographers are human beings, and they're subject to making mistakes, and the people who agree with me and their lexicons may be mistaken, or the Arndt and Gingrich lexicon may be mistaken. We'll just have to look. And in fact, some of us maybe even be guided in giving definitions by our own prejudices. And we're dogmatic in assigning meanings to words because we need definitions that will fit our cases. Are we doing that? Well, with those qualifications and observations, let's look at those lexicons and dictionaries. Now, all of the lexicons, practically, that I read from at all, call attention to the fact that psallo has undergone significant change. In its earliest period of use in classical Greek, plucking, twanging of any kind, plucking a chicken, plucking a bow, plucking a harp, pulling the hair out of your head, as we sometimes do when we try to study the language. We psallo our hair. Later, and especially when you're studying classical Greek, later, in the Septuagint especially, the word came to refer to the twanging of strings associated with playing instruments such as the harp, and especially the harp. And from the sound made by playing on a harp, the word next came to be used of the song that was being sung to the harp's accompaniment. And then finally, where we're interested, at the time of Jesus and the apostles, in Jewish and Christian usage, both the noun and the verb lost the notion of instruments altogether and came to be used only of singing, and the only lexicon that takes exception to that is the notable exception, the Arndt and Gingrich one. In its article on psallo, Kittle's Theological Dictionary traces the word's history through 4 periods. What it calls the Greek sphere, that is, Greek usage uninfluenced by Jewish Christian writings. The Old Testament and Judaism, the New Testament, and then the early church fathers. And it's interesting to note that in discussing the second period, the writer of the article, Delling, notes that a significant shift has begun to occur. And although most of the Septuagint passages using psallo refer to instruments, some do not. Psallo is already beginning to be used occasionally to refer only to the vocal aspect. So the observation is made, quote, one must take into account a shift of meaning in the Septuagint in other passages where the idea of playing is not evident. And then in discussing that New Testament period in particular, Delling writes, quote, the literal sense, by or with the playing of strings, still found in the Septuagint, is now employed figuratively. There is nothing to suggest that psalmos and hymnos relate to texts of different genres. Now, to try to clarify that in some language that will make sense to you if you know nothing about classical Greek or the Septuagint or New Testament usage. If you think it's strange that a word should change its meaning in the course of its historical development, and if somebody has told you, well, even if it should, it always carries whatever original baggage was there, you might think of an example or two out of our own English language. Take one even that's a musical term, the word lyric. The word lyric comes from the word lyre, not falsifier, but L-Y-R-E. An instrument that you play on, a sort of lap harp, not the big kind. But the word lyric today means what? Though it derived from a word that means a musical instrument, a lyre. Today, when you talk about a song's music and lyrics, lyrics mean what? Words. The lyrics are the words as distinguished from the musical notation or any background to the performance of it. You have the same sort of thing that you're familiar with in the New Testament with the change of meaning in words. Take a word that you'd know even if you don't know any Greek per se, ecclesia. You say, oh, I recognize that word. That word means church. Well, in its distinctive Jewish Christian usage, it means church. But in its common usage, the word ecclesia just means gathering. Town hall meeting, that sort of thing. So in English, words shift dramatically so that lyric, though derived from the instrument, comes eventually to mean the words as opposed to the melody, the musical notation or instrumentation. Ecclesia, a word that even in the New Testament that you'd be familiar with, the word meant this generally, but it came to mean it was given a special usage among Christians. Okay. Well, is it reasonable to think that what most of these lexicons say happened with Salo, that really occurred? Somebody says, well, it still nags me, Rubel, that you admitted that the best lexicon, that Arndt and Gingrich lexicon, says sing to the accompaniment of the heart, to sing praise. Well, I think you're right. That bothers me too. And when I looked at that, I thought, I just may have to retreat from my position on Salo. All I want to do is be honest and fair with the data. But since it was out of step with most of the data, you do decide, I think, you want to look a little more deeply. The English translation of the Bauer 5th edition by Arndt and Gingrich just made a mistake. Now, that's all you can say. So let's move on. No, you say, well, wait a minute. Okay, Rubel, you're standing up there telling us it's a mistake, but convince us. Well, you probably didn't catch it, but I mentioned that what we generally call Thayer's lexicon is a translation of a German Grimm-Wilke dictionary. What we call Arndt and Gingrich is the English translation of the Bauer 5th edition German lexicon. And if you remember, I read you the Bauer definition given in the German original. Bauer says, quote, to extol by singing praises, to sing praises. The translators, Arndt and Gingrich, inserted what is not in the German original, sing to the accompaniment of a harp. In fact, they did put that in parentheses, to the accompaniment of a harp. Sing praise. You say, well, yeah, but they're Greek scholars, maybe they had good cause to. Okay, let's look at it. The German source, Bauer, 5th edition specifically, and all previous editions, gives no hint of instrumental accompaniment in the word and defines Salo the way all the other lexicons do, that in its New Testament usage it just means to sing. Arndt and Gingrich didn't translate Bauer at that point without modifying him. Why did they change it, and was the change justified? Following the death of Dr. Arndt, and by the way, 1957 was the publication date of that translation. Following the death of Dr. Arndt, the publishers of that English version, University of Chicago Press, contracted with Dr. Frederick Danker in St. Louis to work with Dr. Gingrich, still alive, one of the two original translators, Arndt and Gingrich, to bring out an updated and, if necessary in any instance, revised edition of the Arndt Gingrich lexicon, the Bauer Arndt Gingrich, if you give it its correct title. And upon learning that such a revision was in prospect, one of our brethren, most of you probably won't know him, he's a rather obscure figure in our history, Hugo McCord at Oklahoma Christian College, wrote a letter to Dr. Danker. Brother McCord was kind enough to give me a photocopy of the original correspondence, and in the little book that I mentioned a moment ago, the text of those letters is reproduced for you. And so on September 28, 1962, In his typical gracious way, Dr. McCord writes, Dr. Frederick W. Danker, Concordia Theological Seminary, St. Louis, Missouri. Dear Dr. Danker, your book, Multi-Purpose Tool, has been a great help to me. Brother McCord has studied the letters that Jesus writes to the 7 churches. He begins by praising. Okay. Dr. Danker, some of you would know his book, Multi-Purpose Tools of Bible Study. It's an excellent book. Next paragraph. Continually, I stand amazed at the scholarship in the Arndt Gingrich lexicon. It is my understanding that under the direction of Dr. Gingrich, you are now revising that lexicon on the word solo. Since Thayer, Green, Abbott Smith, etc., limit the New Testament meaning to sing praises, I would appreciate the reasoning that brought Drs. Arndt and Gingrich to insert, quote, to the accompaniment of a harp, close quote, in relation to Romans 15:19, Ephesians 5:19, and 1 Corinthians 14:15. Further, why is the phrase excluded in relationship to James 5:13? With all good wishes, I remain very truly yours, Hugo McCord. The Secretary's initials are on the letter if you're interested in those. DG. To say, look, my view is, and can you help me buttress that? I wrote them a letter saying, I'm doing study on the verb solo. Can you help me? What did the word mean in its New Testament usage? There can be no doubt that the verb solo originally had reference to a musical instrument. In fact, in early days, it could be used for things like plucking hair and twanging a bowstring. Isn't it amazing? You'd think some of these people were working from the same literature with the way they write. As applied to a musical instrument, it meant plucking strings with the fingers as opposed to the use of the plectrum. From this, psalmos, the noun, came to denote in strictness a song sung to the accompaniment played on a harp. But it is easy to move from this meaning to the more general meaning of sing praise or song of praise. This change does seem to have taken place by New Testament times. For example, Paul uses the verb solo of singing in the spirit and singing with the mind, 1 Corinthians 14:15. It's difficult to see what relevance the use of a stringed instrument has to either. Again, it's unlikely that James 5:13 refers to the use of a harp. There's no evidence that every Christian could play a harp. And if you don't recall the James 5:13 passage, is any among you happy? Let him do whatever this verb is. Let him solo. It's an imperative, saleto. Let him solo. I think, and I'd never thought of this point until he said, hey, whatever that passage says, it says of Christians, look, anytime one of you gets happy, solo. He said, you really think all those Christians could play harps? They could use their voices. Again, it's unlikely that James 5:13 refers to the use of a harp. There's no evidence that every Christian could play a harp. But every Christian is required to sing in this way. It thus seems fairly clear that among New Testament Christians, notice he even uses that term. It thus seems fairly clear that among New Testament Christians, both the verb and the noun were used of singing songs of praise. Well, with regard to the linguistic data, it is consistent, it is clear. The only notable exception that can be cited is one that in the grist mills of scholarly research, the first English translation of Bauer by Arndt and Gingrich, that has been admitted to be a mistake and has been corrected. Somebody says, but Rubel, I've seen some letters and documents and photocopies out of lexicons that some of our brothers who use instrumental music, that they will just pass out to you in reams. And I have a copy of Tom Burgess's book, and he photocopies some of those and letters. What do you deal with that? Those are without exception. Without exception. Photocopies of pages from classical lexicons and pieces of correspondence from professors in classics departments of universities. They are not photocopies of New Testament lexicons, and they are not pieces of correspondence from people of the reputation of Morris and these other people who are New Testament scholars. If you were to write me, in terms of my academic training, I am a philosopher and my specialty is Plato, and I've had to work in classical Greek. If you were to write me in care of the philosophy department at Vanderbilt, I teach at the medical school, we don't do a lot of Greek over there, but if you were to write me in care of the philosophy department, and I do get some letters there, and you were to ask me, Rubel, out of your study in Plato, tell me what this word means, I'd tell you that it means to play an instrument. Because you'd be asking me a question as a scholar of classical Greek and a piece of classical Greek literature. And I'd tell you the same thing these people tell those folks and that they reproduce and distribute. But you see, the question is being begged. Nobody challenges that psallo in classical Greek means play instruments. The question is, in Jewish and Christian usage, koine Greek, common level street man's Greek used in the New Testament time, the language in which the New Testament is written. And by the way, reading the New Testament after you read Plato and Aristotle is like see Dick run, see Jane jump. I mean, you should start there. And and New Testament Greek's not so threatening. If you go the other way, it wears you out. But anyway, you're talking two different directions within the same language. And the vocabularies and the syntax and the rules of grammar, though often alike and overlapping, though in classical generally more convoluted and with more exceptions, there are vocabulary and other differences. It's like the thing that happens with the English language today. If you used an English dictionary, one produced in the British Isles for the Britishers, and tried to write a book for American English-speaking folks using those definitions, you'd run into the sort of problems that you run into with classical and Koine Greek. The words are the same and they're spelled the same, and they've got some tie to one another, but they'll come off meaning very different things. And in both definitions of words and especially in idioms and phrases, you really mean some very different things. So it is not an unusual thing. It is not a concocted thing. It's a very common thing that's known among people who work with the languages. I've offered the data that I believe substantiates and have dealt with the one significant exception that would tend to throw into a cocked hat the Arndt Gingrich lexicon. The material that's necessary to show that psallo means to sing. It does not mean to sing the musical accompaniment in the New Testament. It does not mean playing a harp in Jewish and Christian usage. It means to sing. I've shown that lexicographers and commentators who have no anti-instrument bias, as you and I could be accused of having, acknowledge that psallo in the New Testament means simply sing praise. And in the afternoon session, we're going to deal with the material that undergirds the definition. Remember what I told you earlier. You do not establish the meaning of a word by lining up dictionaries and lexicons. That's where you start. If there's controversy about the meaning of the word, you have to decide it by usage and context. And that means going back and looking at some of the history of the period and the use of language in that cultural and historical context. That's what we'll do this afternoon in the beginning session. The beginning of the session when we look at it in its New Testament and 2nd, 3rd century Christian usage. And then we'll bump ahead a bit and look at some things that occurred in the Protestant Reformation and some things that occurred on the heels of that Protestant Reformation in the United States and the controversy of the introduction of instrumental music, not among us, but among Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists. And I'll be able to show you what probably will come as a revelation to most of you. It did to me when I stumbled across it a few months ago. That as with any number of controversies, wasn't unique to us, we just trailed them by a few years. They fought it out before we did. And I'll also maybe refer you to a book written by a Presbyterian where I think we got most of our thunder on some of the early pieces of literature we produced on it, including some of the poor arguments that we made against it, that this fellow in his zeal, I think, trying to create every argument he could imagine, went off searching for. 3 minutes until quitting time. Anybody have a question you think it would be helpful to ask in group and that you want to? Yes, sir.
Give us a rundown on the word a cappella.
Okay. That's an interesting thing, too. This brother says, give us a little rundown on the word a cappella. A cappella music, contemporary English definition of the term a cappella music, means what? Unaccompanied singing. Singing without musical accompaniment. A cappella music, though we've made a cappella into English words, they're Latin words. Does anyone here know what the Latin words a cappella mean, preposition and noun? At church or in church. A cappella music, the very term a cappella means music as performed in church, which is music unaccompanied. That term a cappella comes out of the Middle Ages, where music as performed at church without instrumental accompaniment was distinguished from so-called secular music, which might very often and perhaps even most commonly would involve, the guys playing backup in the band. So it's interesting when you start talking etymology. Solo changes. Lyric is a case where in English the word rooted in lyre, an instrument, now means words as opposed. The very term a cappella to describe the distinctive sort of music we make at church is, if you trace back that term, a concession to the fact that the way we do it is the way historically the church has made her music. A cappella music, at church music, is unaccompanied singing. So, I think the evidence, linguistic evidence, fits very well within that overarching authority principle that I enunciated this morning. That if, in fact, the question is, where does the Bible authorize music of any sort for the New Testament church? And in such passages, what kind of music does it authorize? Well, you can answer that very specifically. You can cite some passages, and you can do these words, ado, humneo, and solo, singing. Okay, show me the passage that says you can't use instruments. I can't show you that passage. It's not in there. But, again, principle of reasoning from this morning. Show me the passage that explains what the early church did for people to have entrance into the church. Well, I can show you these passages about baptizing. And I can do work with lexicons and dictionaries to show that baptize means immerse. And then somebody says, well, show me the passage that says you can't do it by sprinkling. I say, I can't show you that passage. There's no passage that condemns sprinkling. But wait, I think in both cases we've asked the wrong question. The proper question about New Testament authority is not show me the passage that condemns instrumental music or show me the passage that forbids sprinkling. The question should be framed positively. Show me a passage that authorizes singing. I can do that. Do that. Show me the passage that authorizes immersion. I can do that. And with that, I'm content to live and must urge that others do the same to be faithful to the Lord. Thank you for being with me in this hour, and I'll hope to see you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. If you like this content and if you want to see more of it, please leave a like on the video and be sure to leave a comment underneath telling us what you thought about the video. And please subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Alright, I hope everyone has a great day.